Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. We're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner practitioner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And thank you so much for listening. If this is your first time to the podcast, welcome to the podcast. On today's episode, I have a fantastic guest, Oromchian of Dental Medical Counsel. We dive into an optometrist's guide to estate planning. We talk about the purpose and important considerations of your estate planning, when you should consider putting together an estate plan and when to review it. We talk about the different tools and legal documents used in estate planning, how practice owners should include your ownership in the estate plan, and so much more. And this is such an important topic that, like all risk management topics, even like insurance and different things like that, it doesn't always feel like a priority. It can feel, especially with younger ODs and younger families, like these things aren't likely to happen. And to a point, that's true. It's not likely, but these risks in your life can happen. And I've seen this personally from my own friends and community, let alone clients, and a large number of stories from my peers over the years. I've seen what it looks like for a young family to lose a father or mother, or a family to battle after the death of parents, the difficulties that can come with no planning. So if you're in the period of your life where it makes sense to start looking at this, please do. And give yourself the peace of mind knowing that you've made these decisions ahead of time, and you can focus on all of the more fun stuff in your life in terms of enjoying time with your family, building wealth, investing, building businesses, and everything else. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me, Evon, E-V-O-N, at optometrywealth.com. You can find all these contact info and the resources mentioned in the episode on the show notes, which you can find at the Education Hub on my website, www.optometrywealth.com/education. And while you're there, feel free to schedule a no commitment introductory call, and we can talk about whatever's on your mind financially and how we help optometrists all over the country navigate decisions like this and so much more. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Oromchian. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, and I am excited to be joined here today with a special guest, Oromchian of Dental and Medical Counsel. Ali, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. This is a pleasure, and thanks for inviting me. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to talk about the riveting topic, at least to you and me, of estate planning. And try to dive into an optometrist guide to an estate planning and what that means. What are the different things that optometrists should think about as they look at their own estate planning and everything that goes into that. So I'm excited to dive into this topic because it's something that's extremely important. It's, for me, when I think about financial and just life risk management, there's the basic insurance coverages that everyone should be covering themselves with: disability insurance, life insurance. All that basic insurance coverage is, to me, is step one in risk management. But then after that, I think estate planning is a natural transition and next step in terms of what to look at in managing the risks in an optometrist's life, but also just making sure that your desires unfold in the way that you want it. So before we dive into all that, for those that don't know you, just give us a little bit of an overview and a background of who you are and what you do, and a little bit about your firm.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm an optometry lawyer. We work with optometrists, ophthalmologists, and all sorts of doctors all across the country. Our firm is really hyper-focused only on a couple of areas. One is helping young ODs start their careers, either by buying an office or doing a cold startup. We help with transitions, startups, lease negotiations, partnership agreements. So that's a big focus of us. The second part is employment law. So we help with hiring and firing staff members, employment agreements, as the practice grows, you are going to be needing, associate doctors and things of that nature. And so that's where we we help in that area. And then the third is estate planning, and that is living trusts, wills, power of directive, which we'll talk about. But our goal is really to be there from graduation to retirement, and having worked with a lot of young ODs over the years, as just like you mentioned, there's a lot of focus on practice ownership. There's a lot of focus on building wealth and things of that nature. But estate planning tends to be sort of a side topic until later, right? And so that's a big part of, but it's a big part of what we do. And so I'm excited to be here. But in our firm, all we do is we help doctors.
And Ollie, so you bring up a good point in that estate planning is not often the first thing that optometrists want to do as they're getting their finances in order, right? They're often concerned, and this is really for everybody, they're often concerned with building wealth and doing the stuff that's exciting. It's not always fun to think about stuff that can happen to you negatively, and whether it's death, disability, whatever that is, those conversations just aren't very fun and exciting, and it's easy to understand why those things are sort of pushed to the side there. But they're important. They're incredibly important. And in my opinion, like handling these risks, handling these things like insurance and estate planning are what gives you the freedom to then focus on that fun, proactive stuff of working in businesses, of building wealth and investing and all of that other stuff. So let's dive into the topic here. What is estate planning? Like what does that even mean?
Yeah, no, that's a really good first question, because people are usually confused by it. I mean, estate planning at its core is really the process of arranging for the transfer of your assets, properties, responsibilities after your passing. Okay. So it's about ensuring that your wishes are followed and that your loved ones are provided for, once you're no longer here. Now, a lot of times people, when they think of estate planning, they just think about a will, but it really goes beyond simply creating a will. It encompasses, various legal tools and strategies to protect your assets, and make that transition as smooth as possible. I would even go as far as to say that estate planning also involves, obviously, financial planning too, right? And so, because you can do estate planning from a legal perspective, but if you don't have a financial plan and a planner like you helping, then that estate plan really isn't as strong or as effective as it potentially could be, right? But that's really what we're talking about.
Got it. Yep, that makes sense. And from my perspective, I think you're absolutely right. Estate planning is one of the many topics, or one of the many domains that are involved in anyone's financial plan, and it needs to be present, right? It's one that can't be neglected, and it's one that needs to tie into all of the other stuff that you're trying to accomplish with your family and your businesses and in your finances, and they all need to be tied together. And one of the best ways I've heard it described from an estate planning attorney I've done some work with and has done my own estate planning documents as well, is that it's making decisions now that you wouldn't be able to make if something should happen to you, whether it's death, as you mentioned, but also incapacity, just not being able to make decisions for yourself. And several things from what you've just said, several questions sort of come out of that for me. It's number one, who takes care of you if you can't make decisions for yourself? Who takes care of your loved ones? As you mentioned, they're definitely a part of it. And minor children, for example, are a part of that. I've seen pets, a big part of estate plans, right? So that's a broad category, I guess. Who gets your stuff? Who manages your assets on their behalf, and how? And I would include legacy goals. Like what are you trying to accomplish in terms of legacy goals with family, with organizations, charities, churches, all of that kinds of stuff. And as we talked about earlier, like that's not always easy discussions. I mean, to sort of sit down and think through all of these not very exciting things happening to you and who should be involved in all that. And oftentimes like these can be emotional conversations and emotional things to think about. I mean, what's your experience been, Ollie, like seeing that with clients? Like, is it something that's easy for many to think through? Is it tough? Like what have you seen?
Yeah. I've heard on more than many occasions that spouses will say the biggest fights we've had were in filling out your questionnaires and the conversations we've had regarding how to transfer our assets to, our family members, right? Because, one spouse has, a sister that they think would be perfect, and then, or a sibling that's perfect, and then the other spouse thinks that sibling is terrible, and
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
uh,
Uh-huh.
there's all these like family conversations and things that kind of go into the that need to be had, and like you said, they're very difficult because at the end of the day, no one, especially when you're younger and you're just starting your life, as a professional, you're, maybe, recently married, maybe you have kids, the last thing you want to talk about is death and disability, right?
Right.
And so these can be difficult conversations, especially because family is involved, and those are always kind of some hot topics. And so if you're blessed and everyone gets along in the family, and you guys are on the same page, then it's an awesome experience. But sometimes it can be a little bit a little rough, but nonetheless important to do.
Right. And I guess one way to mitigate, even I've seen just with family and friends as well as with clients, like even if family appears to be getting along now, things can change very quickly at your death, or when these decisions need to come into play, and
Oh yeah.
family dynamics can change substantially overnight when there's healthcare decisions involved, when there's assets involved, when there's money involved. So getting these decisions now while everyone is of sound mind and calm, it can make that transition maybe not easier, but at least more straightforward because you've made the decisions ahead of time.
Oh, well, yeah,
And
exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, no, I mean, look, at the end of the day, everyone is going to react to your passing in a different way, right? And people are going to be hurt. People are going to be sad. If it's unexpected, there's that component of it. But like you said, you want to put your wishes down so that the family is not guessing, right? And I'll give you a
yeah,
personal example. One of my sisters, there's a large gap between me and our middle sister. It's like a 14-year gap between us. And so our oldest sister, who's only like a couple of years older than her, is very, wears her heart on her sleeve, right? Like very emotional about things, like, gets, is very connected to all of us. And so she is the one that would, keep someone, on life support forever. Right.
mm-hmm.
and,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
whereas, my other sister is a little bit more, objective, a little bit more logical about certain things. And so, it's sometimes hard to make those decisions on who do you want to make these crazy life decisions if you can't make it yourself. Do you want it to be someone who, is more on the emotional side? Not that that's good or bad, and it's just that's who they are. And then there's people who are more like, no, cut the cord. And so
right,
so
right.
and it's a very personal decision for each spouse, because
Yeah,
the way I look at it is very different probably than my wife looks at it, right? And so
yeah. Interesting point. And another saying I hear quite a bit, I think it rings true, is that everyone has an estate plan. You just may not like it. And what
right,
that means is that by default, your state, the state in which you live, has a way to manage the distribution of your assets at your death, and of deciding who should be guardians for children and things like that.
yeah,
And if you do nothing, then you're leaving that essentially up to the state. And so you have to think about, would you rather have your own wishes documented according to your own desires ahead of
right.
time, or just allow the laws of your state to dictate that? So let's dive in further then. I guess the first question then is, when should an optometrist start thinking about getting their own estate planning done?
Yeah, no, great question. And I, some folks will say, as soon as someone has assets or whatnot. I kind of, push a little back on that a little bit. I think, the right time to start really thinking about asset protections is when you either, buy a practice, buy a home, and you have family. And what I mean by that is if you're married, if you have children, maybe, after your first, or if you feel like you're done having children, those are the moments in time when I think it's a good time to really think about estate planning. Of course, as soon as you buy any asset, you buy your first house, should you think about it? I mean, in an ideal world, of course, but most people are thinking about, how do I pass this on to, my spouse? How do I make sure my kids get these assets if, there's a value? And so I would say 90% of our clients come to us about the time when they're done having children, or they own a home, they have a practice that they built that now is worth something, and they're ready to sort of protect it. So
Got it. Okay. And the growth of the family, I guess, is a major trigger there. What are some triggers in an optometrist's life to review the estate plan once it's put in place?
yeah.
Like, what are some things that can happen in their life that should say, okay, it's time to pull this out, make sure that it's still up to date on what we want to happen?
Yeah. Well, I think anytime you buy like a major piece of asset that appreciates, right? Like a home, something that's an antique, a second property, a second office, maybe anything that appreciates in value, you would want to revisit your estate plan. And then that's one, because we need to add it. I think the second thing is, if there's any major life changes, an estate plan is a living, breathing document. And what I mean by that is that it can be modified at any point, and should be modified if things change. So one example is, let's say you pick a trustee for your trust, and it's someone who you care a lot about. They would be the perfect person to act as a trustee and be responsible for the distribution of the assets. But then something happens to them, right? Medically, something happens, or maybe they lose their job, or maybe they move out of the country or somewhere. Something happens where maybe they're not the best person. That's when, you want to revisit it and maybe remove them, or put them further down the road, down the line, as far as the trustee is concerned, so that you have somebody who can, follow through with all their responsibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And a part of that too would be changes in family relationships, right?
Mm-hmm.
Additional births, deaths in the family, if they're involved in the estate plan, changing in relationships in terms of divorce, or if you're older and you have adult children who are going to be inheriting as a part of the estate plan, evaluate their relationship with their spouses. Those changes should be noted as well. Mm-hmm. Changes in your family should be kept in mind as well, but that's very helpful there. And so what is a part of an estate plan? Like what goes into an estate plan? What should optometrists keep in mind there?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's optometrists, like almost all professionals, have very unique considerations when it comes to estate plans. So here are some of the biggest points to consider. One is, you've got to think about an asset inventory. This begins really by taking stock of all your assets. That includes the practice, the investments, personal belongings, homes, of course. All those things are things that we ask our clients to kind of get into. Then there's a will and a trust. This is where we create sort of a comprehensive will, and then usually it's tied to a living trust to protect and distribute assets according to what the doctor wants, and the doctor and their spouse wants. There's something called probate, which the audience may have heard about. It's basically a big lawsuit that happens if you don't have a living trust, where the court system tries to figure out who owns your assets and who should they be distributed to. And so it's a long process. It's not fun. It eats up the asset of the estate. And then more importantly, it delays things getting into the hands of the right people. So the living trust is really a strong tool there. Then there's the healthcare directive that makes clear instructions for all healthcare decisions, and it appoints someone, a trusted person, to make those medical choices for you, assuming you're unable to do so, right? Assuming you're unable to do so. Then there's succession planning. So if you own your own practice, how do you, you have to plan for the succession of the practice. Is it to a partner? Is it to just any third party? Is it being sold through a broker? All those things. And that can include things like I mentioned, like selling the practice or even passing it down to like a family member or a colleague. Then there's the life insurance part. Do you need life insurance? What kind of life insurance do you need? So we talk a little bit about that. There's term life, which tends to work for a lot of people. Some people are selling whole life insurance policies, which isn't necessarily right for everybody. And then there's of course the tax considerations. So and thankfully we're in a position now that taxes aren't an issue when it comes to death, but
Right.
you never know what the future will hold.
Right. And let's talk about these point by point, because there's a lot of good information here. Number one, I think you bring up a good point, and just start with listing out and taking account of all of your different assets and how they're titled, and if you have beneficiaries, who the beneficiaries are. Just sort of take inventory of everything in your life financially. Let's talk about trusts and wills, and what is the difference between a trust and a will, and why would you consider getting a living trust versus just using the wills? And I think you hit the nail on the head there already in terms of probate. So one part of that is avoidance of probate, especially like in states like California, where it can be expensive and time intensive. But what are some of the other differences and reasons between a trust and a will?
Yeah, no, that's it's funny because when people think about the trust and the will, they usually put it together, right, as being one because they're so closely tied. But they're both estate planning tools. They help manage distribution of assets after someone passes, but they operate very differently and they serve very distinct purposes. And so here's how I would sort of summarize that. So the first would be distribution of assets. In a will basically outlines your wishes regarding the distribution of the assets after your death. It talks about who should inherit your property, money, and assets. Okay, it's just that simple. A trust, on the other hand, is actually a legal entity that holds and manages the assets for the benefit of specific individuals. Okay, and those individuals are known as beneficiaries. And so it allows for a seamless transfer of those assets to the beneficiary without going through what we just talked about, which is, probate, which is sort of the second part. That's the biggest difference, and the one that we usually, talk about the most. And the reason is because it's a court supervised process of transferring your assets. So in a will, you typically have to go through probate, which, as I mentioned, is a court supervised process. That
Public process as well.
Yeah, yes, actually, that's a really important point. Yeah, it is a public process because they have to validate the will and ensure that the assets are distributed according to your wishes. And so, but you have to figure out what assets do you actually own, right? If you own a home but there's a mortgage on it, well, the home doesn't just transfer over to someone. It needs to go through this process. And so it's time consuming, it's expensive. But, the public component of it is exactly right. I mean, that is, really problematic because the whole world suddenly realizes and can see how much, you have in assets and who's getting it, right, potentially. Yeah. And so you can imagine a lot of random uncles and aunts that no one knew you had suddenly come out of the woodwork.
6 cousins from way back when you haven't talked to for 20 years suddenly coming out. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And so the trust avoids all that, right? Because the assets that are in a trust usually bypass probate, which means they can be distributed much more quickly. They're distributed privately. And so no one really knows what assets you have. And, optometrists usually have a lot of assets, and with life insurance and other things, those numbers can really add up. So,
right. Yeah. And the interesting thing about the uses of trust is that will talk to us about like how much leeway and flexibility does someone have in the language of the trust to determine who should get the assets and in what way. Some examples that I've seen are that, especially with children, are that you can determine the ages of the children to which they're going to get the assets and how the math would work on how the assets would be distributed. And should it be allowed for college education? Should it be allowed for other higher education? Is there a GPA requirement? Like there, from what I've seen, there's a lot of leeway in terms of the language you can put in there, the flexibility, the way you would want, specifics on how you'd want the assets to pass, and as well as the ability to sort of implement your own values and pass down your own values to that next generation. Like, what have you seen? How much leeway does an OD have on the language there?
Oh, huge. I mean, trust offers so much more flexibility. I mean, like you said, you can set specific conditions for asset distribution. For example, it could be gradual over time. It could be managed for beneficiaries if there's, children with special needs, or like you even mentioned, taking care and providing for pets. I mean, there's just so much. And I think the craziest one I saw from a client was the children were going to get their assets if they went to professional school, right? And I told them it was one of the few times where it was language that I had to actually significantly advise against, because I mean, you can imagine what would happen, right? If somebody has assets waiting, and let's say they don't want to be a professional, they don't want to be an OD or a dentist or a veterinarian or a lawyer or a CPA. Can you just imagine them going through school just to say they did, just to get the assets and just waste?
Or if they don't have the GPA to get in or whatever it is, are they effectively disinherited? That's basically fascinating.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, there's there's children that, for example, I mean, they had young children actually, so there was no way of them knowing what they would turn out as young adults. But you could have a child who wants to be a chef, who is more artistic than they are, memorizing and loving science and loving math and loving the law. They may just not want to be any of those things, and you're, like you said, you're disinheriting them pretty quickly. So
yeah. And in terms of the wills, if an optometrist works with an attorney and they determine that they should have the living trust, and they've got the living trust set up, and as you mentioned, like those can be the revocable living trusts. They tend to be revocable living trusts, and they can be amended, revoked, changed. They're living, breathing documents. But as a part of that, as a part of the package, they will have wills also.
Yeah.
Typically, they're just pour over wills, I guess, as a way to sort of catch anything that doesn't get included in the living trust and pour it into the trust. But talk to us about how, one of the things on the minds of younger families is how minor children are cared for if something were to happen to both parents. And talk to us about how naming guardians and guardianship fits in with wills and the estate plan.
Yeah. Guardians, I think one of the perks of having a living trust is that you can really manage who is the guardian of the children, and which can be a person different than the trustee, who can be different than someone who manages the financial aspects of your estate. But a guardian, has to be someone who can take on the children, not just love them, because there might be a lot of people in your family that can love them, but do they have the ability, to take on your children if they have their own children, for example. Now, usually what we advise is to have these conversations before naming someone in a trust, meaning, go talk to the person that you want to, who may be, you're asking to be the guardian of your children. See if they're willing and able to. And I'll give you a perfect example. There's another personal example. My wife has two sisters, just like I do. One of them is they're both younger than her. But one of them is here local and has three boys of her own. And my two sisters, one is married, one is not. And the one that's married has grown children. I mean, they're graduated college, they're working and whatnot. And so one of the things we did in our trust was we named my sister as our guardian for the kids, because her sister that has the three boys, there would be no way she could take on our three girls plus her own three boys while they were
Right.
younger, right? Especially in the house that they live and all those kind of things. It would have been uncomfortable for our kids, and more importantly, uncomfortable for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now though, 7 years later, my sister and her husband, have retired. They're traveling the world. They're doing all the things that empty nesters do, right? and my wife's sister has now, her boys have gotten older, and so now it's a little bit more manageable. And so what we have done is we've now changed the guardianship from my sister to her, just because of what we talked about, right? Life changes, and so as a result of that, you got to make changes in your living trust. But the beauty of this is that with regard to guardianships and almost every other thing, you can do it pretty easily. So
yeah. And in terms of this leads into another good point. And in terms of the trust in the will, another important part of that, separate from guardians, is the trustees of a trust, which is the person who will manage the assets according to the terms. And you can name successors. And then on the wills, it's the executor, or executrix, which has a similar function in the will. And what should you look for in those two roles? Should it be the same person? Should it be different than a guardian? What should you look for in there?
Yeah, no, I think a trustee, an executor, depending on what you have, can be the same person as a guardian, but can also be a totally different person. What I think the key is, and we can talk about what the trustees' roles are, but I think the key is you got to make sure that the guardian and this trustee that you're putting in place have a relationship, like a good relationship with one another, right? If they don't get along, if they see the world in opposite ways, that's going to be really, really tough for the children and for your beneficiaries if you pass, because there's going to be a lot of open debate and potentially conflict there, when in reality we want them to be on the same page, right? And so sometimes people put like one family member as a trustee and one family member as a guardian, but the two people see things differently, and I had one case actually a couple of years ago, right before COVID, and it was really kind of crazy because the conversation between the two spouses that were our clients was that one of the guardians believe, or the person that they had selected as a guardian really believed in private schools and really believed in the education that provides over the public school system. So if something should happen to them, they thought that their kids would have been put in private school. But the trustee, the person responsible really for the finances, what was apparently very, very conservative with finances. And so they, had this whole debate and conversation about, would the trustee even, authorize and allow the kids to go to this private school if something should happen to them. And my advice to them was, that's not something you want to deal with, or you want the kids to deal with, or anybody to deal with post your death, so.
Right. Yeah. And that's not only do those people need to have the ability, whether it's financially or whether it's raising children, or as mentioned earlier, like making healthcare decisions, not only do they have to have the ability, but if they're different people, you need to make sure that the dynamics and their values, I guess, not only match yours, but they can work together in that scenario. That's interesting. It's part of what makes this such a, at times, difficult discussion, right? Is after you're gone, you're relying on people to make decisions for your loved ones and for your wealth, and are they able to do that? And talk to us then about the role of the trustee. And I guess before we get to that, let me ask you one more question on the roles here. Is that should you notify these people ahead of time that they're going to be a part of the estate plan and all this? Should it be secret until it's triggered? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think 100% you should notify the trustees. I mean, you got to let them know kind of where the living trust and the estate plan is, if there's a combo or a safe deposit box, like how do they get into that? You got to let them know. It can't be a
Got it.
surprise,
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that makes
um,
sense. Yep.
yeah. But I think the role of the trustee as the administrator, is really for the administration of the trust. So they have to ensure that the terms and conditions of the trust are carried out per your request. And so there's a couple of huge responsibilities. One, they have to be a trusted person. So there's something called a fiduciary duty, which is it's a legal, ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. So you want somebody who will take that seriously. They obviously have to be able to manage the asset. So they will be investing the assets within the trust. They'll be trying to preserve them, to try to grow them, and so that person has a lot of responsibilities with regard to that. Then there's the distribution of the assets, which depends on your wishes. How do you distribute the income, the principal? How and when do the beneficiaries get them? So all of that is done by the trustee as well. And then the parts that are not so fun, and this is where you need a trustee who can also focus on this is the record keeping, right? They have to keep like really good detailed records. There's the legal compliance part. They need to make sure that the trust is complying with all laws. There's a lot of paperwork type thing that needs to happen as well. To avoid impartial or to have impartiality, avoid conflicts of interest. So,
Got it. And as someone like establishes, like if they're meeting with you or your team and they're writing these things for the first time, creating a trust, creating a will, they are the optometrist doing this while you're alive. You are typically the trustee and the beneficiary, correct? Like they're
yeah,
effectively, although the titling of things change, effectively not much has changed in terms of who has the ability to use and enjoy the assets and you have control over them. It's really as you either lose the ability to make those decisions or at your death are where these other people start to really come to play. Correct? Is that correct?
that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean
Okay.
it's at death and also at incapacity, depending on whether the same people are named, as powers of attorney and whatnot.
So let's talk about that. We have that financial power of attorney, which gives broad powers to make financial decisions on someone's behalf, and the advanced healthcare directive, or those healthcare power of attorneys for healthcare decisions. What are the triggers for those two documents to come into play?
It's really the incapacity of the person making it. So if you can't make your own healthcare decisions, right? Whether it's because you're in a coma or you're not of the right state of mind or whatnot, that's when those really kind of come into play. It's really before death, but you're incapacitated.
Got it. Okay. And I'm assuming there needs to be like a doctor needs to verify that you are no longer eligible to make financial decisions or are not of sound mind, correct?
That's typically the way. Yeah, that's
Okay.
typically the way.
Okay.
I mean, there's ways around that if you needed to, but that's typically the way. Yeah. And that's there's a lot of ambiguity about that. How is a doctor able to make that decision? Should they be the ones that are able to make that decision? But that is the
Right.
standard. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And I guess one thing I'll add just lastly is just beneficiaries and asset titling or account titling.
Mhm.
Beneficiaries are probably the one thing that regardless of where you're at in your career, you will have that one single estate planning thing to deal with, and that almost everybody's going to have some retirement plan somewhere, most likely. And so just keep an eye on your beneficiaries, even if you're not at a point where you feel like you need some of this other stuff. You probably have accounts that have beneficiaries on them. If you have life insurance, make sure you're reviewing the beneficiaries. And Ollie, talk to us about implementation, because I feel like this is one of the areas where me as the advisor really gets our hands dirty after going through that whole process in terms of helping to change titling of assets where we're involved. updating beneficiaries as needed, looking at charitable goals and seeing how that fits. After someone has met with an estate planning attorney, got the documents written up, notarized, signed, all that fun stuff, how do they go about using the documents and actually implementing some of the stuff that's involved there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest error I see, the biggest error I see when it comes to estate plan is not titling the properties correctly. Okay. And so what I mean by that is just creating an estate plan is not sufficient, right? It's not sufficient. Yeah. What you have to do is you have to make some changes. So one change, and this is the one that, people I think forget most of the time, which is taking the title on their home and basically putting it into the name of their trust. Right?
Okay. How is that done typically?
So typically the law firm that's helping you do the estate plan will do this for you, which is they fill out some transfer documents. They send it to the county where your property is titled, and then at that point the title changes to your living trust. Now there's no tax consequences to it, or there shouldn't be at least. All of that sort of happens very cleanly, but it changes from your name to the name of the trust. Now, one thing I would tell everyone to just be careful of is that if you are doing this and you suddenly get a tax bill that is much higher than what you had before, then the county may have made an error and might be considering this transfer as a sale. So we've had situations where somebody bought a house for $500,000 many years ago. They eventually put it in their trust. It's now worth $1.5 million, and suddenly they get a tax bill for $1.5 million, right? And that's because someone made a mistake, either at the county level or at the law firm that was helping with the estate plan. So what we recommend is at that point you just got to let them know that this is a tax-free title transfer. Because you're just taking it from your name to your trust name. So that titling the properties correctly is vitally important. I would say never try to do it yourself. Just have the law firm do it for you. It's worth the $50, $100, $200, whatever that they might charge. And then just so that there's no mistake. And then titling any bank accounts or whatnot, I think those are vital as well. You don't necessarily need to title your checking account if there's not a lot of cash in there, but any savings or any big accounts, I would retitle.
Got it. Yeah, and some savings accounts, like if you're using online savings accounts or high yield savings accounts, some will allow you to just convert that account into a trust account or into the name of the trust. Others may force you to open a new one. And I kind of agree with the checking account, especially if you've got a lot of different connections or automatic bill pays or things like that. And you're going to be forced to either change the account number or have to redo all that. It may be simpler to just name the trust as the beneficiary of that checking account and then go from there. On the house, have you seen any issues with lenders if there's a mortgage on the property in terms of them not really accepting that transfer? I guess one thing to just do is just check in with your lender and notify them. Or if you're going through the purchase process and are going to name the title of the property and the name of the trust, let everyone involved in the transaction know that. But have you seen any issues on the mortgage side?
Yeah, it's a great point. Usually the bigger lenders, the Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, those we haven't seen any issues because they understand, I think, that this happens, and so it's not a breach of your agreements, your mortgage agreements and whatnot with them. But it's good to check. Where we have seen problems is sometimes with credit unions and small local banks. And so okay. With credit unions and small local banks, I would encourage you to talk to them and make sure that this is okay. And if it's not okay, how to fix it. And if it's and if they don't allow it, then figuring out some path forward. Because they all should allow it. They just may not, the person you're talking to may not know exactly how to do it. And so you've got to sort of figure out. But one thing I would say is don't refinance your house. If somebody tells you, if someone tells you, oh, sorry, we can't do this, you got to refinance your house or something. Don't do that, especially if you've got a low interest rate, right? They might be tricking you.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Right.
yeah. Yeah. I had one person tell me this on actually it was like a commercial property they own. The lender said to them, oh no, sorry, you have to refinance out of it. And they had this like crazy, like 2.8% loan on this like, building for their practice. And the loan at that time, it wasn't, it wasn't like, in the past couple of weeks, but it was like, it had gone up to like 4.5%, 5%. And I was like, under no circumstances you have to do that,
Okay, that's
right.
good to keep in mind. And for the listener, look at other assets that should be involved. If you have taxable brokerage accounts, and those should be involved in that trust, make sure that taxable brokerage account is recategorized or retitled to be a trust account. That's something we'll do with our clients here where we can. If you have life insurance policies that should send those funds into the trust, make sure that the beneficiaries are reviewed and changed. And then review these things.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is so easy to just let go and not review, even after major life changes, is the beneficiaries of all this stuff, of retirement accounts, of life insurance, all the horror stories I've heard in terms of like past spouses being still named as beneficiaries after divorces, things like that. So just review this stuff regularly, especially the beneficiaries. That can be pretty easily done. And then one thing I'd like to hear your thoughts, if you have any particular thoughts on, is just if there's charitables involved. Often what I'll look at is if there's pre-tax or traditional IRAs or retirement accounts involved, and there's goals to leave dollars to charity. Like those pre-tax dollars might be the first dollars to use, simply because your heirs would pay tax on it, but those charities would not. Like, do you have any particular thoughts around how charities or nonprofits should be involved there?
Yeah. I mean, there's actually even a bigger conversation that we probably don't have time to chat about today, but the whole beneficiary aspect of it is very important, because a lot of times when like people have young children, we will say, the beneficiaries of, those accounts that you were talking about, life insurance, investment accounts, those that have it should be the trust. Because, if you've got, let's say a couple $1 million life insurance policy, we don't necessarily want, a child to get that, at death, right? But as the children get older, then we do want those beneficiaries to change from the trust to the child individually, because then you avoid, some double taxation that could occur with something going into the trust and then going to a beneficiary. Okay.
Right.
And so to your point, transitioning that to to your question about charities, you're exactly right. Some, depending on how you want to fund, the money going to the charity, your asset could go to the trust, and then the trust could, invest that money and then give, some of the money that it makes to a charity as sort of a monthly payment or whatnot. Or you could have it be given to that charity, by just putting them down as a beneficiary of of that asset. And so there's a lot of tax conversations that, obviously is very dependent on, your specific situation.
Yeah, maybe that'll be a future conversation.
Yeah.
Let's transition here, and I have one more but big, pretty important topic to sort of cover here, and that's practice owners. And we've talked about a lot of stuff that can apply to associate doctors, to really any optometrist, whether they own a business or not. But I want to ask you about, how do practice owners look at including their business ownership into the estate plan? How do you usually advise them? How do those conversations go? What should they keep in mind?
Yeah. What we do is we have language that basically assigns the corporation assets, whatnot, into the trust at the time of death. That way, there's no interruption, on a day-to-day basis. Because if you try to change, you know, your vendor contracts, all those other things that, you may have to with your business, it's going to cause a lot of disruption. Or even if you try to, transfer your stock, if you own a corporation or LLC, even into the assets, into the trust, I should say, there could be issues with, the state boards, because sometimes they don't recognize that, the estate as having being the proper owner of an OD practice. And so there's a lot of complications like that. So we avoid all of that. And basically what we say is, at the time of death, the corporation stock or assets would not transfer directly into the estate, and then the trustee manages it from there.
Okay. So it's separate from this will that sort of pours everything over. It's sort of a after death assignment of the ownership into the trust. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
You don't want anything in the portable will over $100,000, because then it triggers probate. So.
Yes. Okay. So that's helpful. And there's probably a much larger discussion that we probably don't have time for here, but about appropriate succession planning in the practice and what that looks like, because it's one thing to do what you talked about, which is sort of the mechanics of getting the ownership into the trust and having it managed. But then what happens with the business next, whether at your death or incapacity? If there's multiple owners, is there a buy-sell agreement? So there's all this succession and contingency planning that I think is a much larger conversation, maybe for another time. But I think the owners should think about it in terms of just the what ifs of the practice. What if something happens to you as the owner? What then happens next with the practice? You mentioned estate taxes. I think you and I probably agree. There's not too much probably for optometrists to be concerned about, at least at this time. The exemptions are pretty high. They're expected to sunset down to almost cut in half, essentially, after 2025. Is there anything that optometrists should keep in mind about future estate taxes?
There's this old adage, right, that says, if you knew what year you were going to die, you could create the perfect estate plan, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually, do something really unique in this regard, which is I usually say, look, just ignore the tax component, the death tax component of your estate plan in your planning, because there's no way of knowing what the tax will be in the year you pass away, right?
Yeah.
In the last 10 years, we've seen zero tax, right? Or zero death tax, which exclusion, which basically means every dollar, will be taxed. We've seen $1 million. We've seen $2 million. We've seen everything. Right now it's like $13 million, almost $13 million. I mean, there's just so much variance there that it's hard to imagine planning appropriately. What I can tell you is that the estate laws are meant to help the transfer of assets. And so they're hopefully, depending on the administration and what Congress wants to do, you're going to have strong treatment. And so having a living trust, having a will, doing the proper planning is all you can do. And then it gives you the flexibility of doing things, assuming, the laws change and we need to pivot. But not having a plan at all is the worst thing you can do, because then you go to probate.
Right. So. Right. And I guess it's just you bring up a good point. I remember just earlier in my years seeing through other clients, irrevocable life insurance trusts set up because of old laws that had a much lower exemption or a much higher amount of the estate would be taxable, but are now useless, essentially, right. And would be a mess to unwind. So you bring up a good point. I guess the bottom line there is just to keep in touch with your professionals proactively. And as laws change, those professionals, that team will help you to plan accordingly. And, perhaps I guess the other thing is that your state may have particular estate tax laws that are different or lower thresholds. So keep an eye on your individual state, but in general, appreciate you sharing your thoughts there. And although we've talked about a lot, one final thought for me is that It doesn't have to be overly complicated. Even if you're a young optometrist with a younger family, some of these tools still apply to you, and even in a very basic sense of just getting these basic estate planning documents set up, naming guardians for the children. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. But what are your thoughts, Ali, on final thoughts, any particular things that optometrists should keep in mind as they look at or create or review their own estate planning?
Well, I think you said something that I think is really important to think about, which is starting early with your entire estate plan and financial plan is very, very important. Because, what I hear a lot is, I will get to it when I have money, right?
Yeah.
And yes, 30 years ago, estate planning was meant for the uber wealthy, right? The multimillionaires and so, but that's not really the case anymore. You should start earlier in your life with the estate planning side. But even earlier than that, you should be doing your financial planning, right? Your financial planning. And that includes, coming up with a plan for paying off debt, coming up with a plan on, building a nest egg, having your different categories, right? Having your pre-tax, 401k type stuff, having real estate, having some life insurance, focusing on your business. Like, all of these things are just buckets that are so important for everyone to have. And sometimes if we wait too long until we have money, it'll be too late to let it grow immensely.
Right.
And
right.
so, I think, starting with a good advisor, and starting that process and having those conversations. And then as, time allows, then you say, okay, you know what? I have a practice now and I have a home and we just got married. Okay, let me create my first, living trust and will and whatnot. It'll be very simple, very straightforward. And then as you add children to the mix one day, maybe, then we do slight modifications of the estate plan, to add and talk about how you take care of those children, like we've talked about today. So there's, there's ways of handling it, but the sooner you start, especially with the financial planning side, the better off you will be.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying all that. And Ali, I really appreciate your time. This has been fun for me. Hopefully, I think the listeners will get a lot out of it. And where can the optometrists find, follow, and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, no. So, our website is a great place. We've got a lot of content there. I write a lot of articles about this topic and a lot of other topics that are relevant to optometrists. So, our website is D like Dental, M like Medical Counsel, COUNSEL.com. So, dmcounsel.com. And or you can call us at 925-999-8200. But even if you just Google my name, there's a lot of material we have on there to reach us. And we can, we do a lot of consultations on these kind of topics, and then kind of help, plan the next steps. So yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm actually, I don't even know if I told you, but we just finished a book that I was writing on estate planning that we'll probably publish by the end of the year. And so if anybody's interested in getting that, just reach out to us and we'll put you on the early list. So
awesome. I will get my name on the early list there. No,
you're already on there. Don't worry.
Awesome. I'll put all of your contact information and website and everything into the show notes. So go ahead and check out the show notes for links to that. In the meantime, really appreciate you all listening to the episode. We will catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.